Today, I want to take you on a bit of a journey to a botanical frontier, a place where the environment is so brutal that the plants that we find there have evolved into all sorts of strange, bizarre, almost alien-looking life forms. And a place where the human environment is equally brutal, characterised by decades of instability, piracy, terror, and seemingly endless poverty. It's a place that isn't particularly conducive to botanical exploration. I'm talking about Somalia, a land where the plants are so miraculous and wondrously bizarre that they belong in everybody's collection, and a place where there could be so much more just beyond the horizon. We just haven't had a chance to go exploring. So let's go for a bit of a journey into the bizarre, fantastic and mysterious plants of Somalia. So I want you to picture this environment. Endless, bleak, arid, rocky plains that stretch as far as the eye can see, that eventually terminate in bleak, rocky, arid hills and gorges. It's an environment, a landscape of extremes, and the plants that grow in this seemingly unhospitable place have naturally evolved in all sorts of strange and wonderful ways. Even plants from families that we're otherwise familiar with look utterly alien and completely strange because they've been cut off and needed to evolve to survive a landscape that is completely unforgiving. And the most amazing thing about it is that it's possible that we've barely even scratched the surface, because botanical expeditions to Somalia have only really occurred every couple of decades. The nature of the country itself doesn't lend itself to scientific exploration. And so I'm going to share with you some really weird euphorbias, Dorstenias, aloes, and maybe the weirdest of all, some asclepiads. But we have to open our mind to the possibility that there could be ever more wondrous, bizarre and alien looking plants just beyond the next hillside. Undiscovered, waiting for some intrepid explorer to go and see what's there. Now, to most succulent collectors, the idea of a euphorbia is pretty standardised, right? We've got cactus looking things like this Euphorbia obesa. Some are squat, as in this case, some are tall, columnar shaped things, but by and large your succulent euphorbias look like cactuses. And that's certainly true of some of the Somali euphorbias. For example, this is Euphorbia columnaris. It's isolated to only one small pocket of that desolate Somali landscape, and as you can see, it's tall growing, columnar thing, looks a lot like a cactus. This one's been grafted. What you're going to find is that your Somali euphorbias in cultivation reputedly do not do well on their own roots. So this one here looks fairly typical of the genus of Euphorbia. Maybe the most interesting thing about it is the shape of its spines. They've kind of got a cow horn shape. But when you start digging past plants like this one, you can find some really strange and surprisingly unique euphorbias, and I'm going to share the first of those with you now. Now, don't mind what this has been grafted on, this big tall column here. This is Euphorbia canariensis from the Canary Islands, a whole continent away. What we're interested in here is this little button looking thing at the top. That is called Euphorbia turbinoformis. It's a low growing, squat, clumping, almost button shaped thing. But when you really zero in on the skin of it, the epidermis, it's got almost like this bubbly reptilian texture. It looks almost like a cross between a reptile and a cactus. Utterly bizarre. Now, in this instance, I was fortunate enough recently to be sent some little pups, little offsets, not rooted. And like I said, I've heard these things don't do well on their own roots, so to give it the best chance of success, I have grafted it up, and hopefully it's going to take, And hopefully I'm going to have a nice little clump of these things growing out the top. And maybe one day I can experiment with growing them on their roots. But that's for another day. Now Euphorbia turbiniformis is pretty weird, right? But there's another low, squat Somali Euphorbia that takes that idea of weirdness and magnifies it a millionfold. The plant I'm talking about is called Euphorbia horwoodii. And in habitat, it almost just looks like this, you could describe it as almost starfish-like, a little squat thing that just sits prostrate on the ground, on the rocks. Easy to ignore, easy to walk right past, I can only imagine. Now the funny thing about these is when you put them into cultivation, graft them up, because again, they just really want to die on their own roots when you put them into a pot. They grow completely differently. They start growing arms and looking almost like a medusoid, you know, Euphorbia caput medusae or something like that. They completely transform in shape when you put them into your collection compared to how they grow out in the arid outcrops of Somalia. I can't think of another plant that reacts to human intervention in the same way. It's utterly bizarre. But even in its most natural growth form, I'm sure you can agree that it looks nothing like a Euphorbia and barely even looks like a plant, in my opinion. Now, if you're enjoying Arid Zine and you want to support the show, let me direct your attention to some very rad merch, like the Arid Zine Cordex Club t-shirt, amongst many others. And I do know that at the time of filming, we're coming into the Northern Hemisphere winter, which means that it's time for jumpers. You can see this one here. This is the Winter Dormant. There's also a Winter Active one. Not bad, I reckon. Maybe a cool Christmas gift. There's a link on the screen if you want to buy one, and every purchase helps me keep churning out this sick succulent content. Anyway, let's get back into Somali succulents. Now, not all the succulents of Somalia are utterly bizarre. You can find beauty amongst the beasts, so to speak. Now, one of the more prominent features of the natural Somali landscape are its aloes. I'm not going to go through a comprehensive journey of all the Somalian aloes, but I will share with you one that I think is particularly beautiful. This one here is Aloe somaliensis. That name, very indicative of where you can find it. And the beautiful thing about this, of course, as you can see, is its naturally variegated leaves. That's right, this isn't a variegated plant in the typical sense. It's not a mutation. This is just how they grow, with this fantastic patterning all over the leaves. Now, what you're going to find is that that natural variegation creates this sort of mottled look that I suppose lends itself to a degree of camouflage. Because in an environment so sparsely populated by plants, and those that are there are succulents, full of life-giving water, the animal population of the area, of course, is seeking them out. Something to eat, something to devour. And so these plants, they have to evolve a way to avoid being eaten into non-existence. And so this mottled appearance helps this plant blend in to the mottled, shady areas. Now, I don't know how effective it is in habitat, but what it certainly does in our collections is it adds a degree of beauty and wonder amongst a collection of plants that I'm not sure you could typically describe them in the same way. But that's Aloe somaliensis, a fantastic example of one of the species of aloes that do dot the landscape in that incredibly bleak environment. Now, I did mention earlier the hills and the gorges that break up that endlessly barren landscape. And so I thought I would turn my attention now to a family of plants that live in that part of the country. I'm talking about the Dorstenias. Now, we might be familiar with Dorstenia foetida. This is an interesting relative of the fig. It's defined by a sort of squat cordiciform shape and really weird, almost button-like flowers. Now, Dorstenia foetida, this plant here, it does grow in Somalia, but it's not endemic. What I mean by endemic is that it's not restricted only to Somalia. You can find it all up the eastern side of the African continent, over into Arabia and beyond. So it's not really one that I want to focus on because I've got two species of Dorstenias that are restricted only to Somalia, and they're just fantastic, absolutely amazing plants. The first of those plants is this one, Dorstenia lavrani, and you can see already that this fairly immature specimen has taken on the shape of a palm tree with a trunk and a little crown of leaves and flowers emerging from the top. But the amazing thing about this, and it's only just started in this one, you can see there's a little offset down here. As they mature, as they grow, those offsets will start to emerge from the base and grow more and more of these crowns. And in time, what you'll have is a squat little plant that looks almost like a bonsai grove of palms. There's nothing else in the plant world that I think matches it for sheer beauty and also sheer surprise, because it's not the sort of thing that you typically expect to find. Now, the other interesting thing about your Dorstenia lavrani is that it's the only member of the genus that has got male and female flowers. I'm lucky enough to have both male and female plants, and so every year I have the wonderful joy of growing tiny little Dorstenia lavrani babies and building up a growing collection of these wonderful plants. I reckon come back to Arid Zine 20, 30 years from now and you're going to find this greenhouse is just full of these little miniature palm groves all over the place. I can't get enough of them. But you know what? I don't reckon they're the weirdest of the Dorstenias. Let me show you another one. This gangly looking thing here is a very immature Dorstenia gypsophylla. Now, it's called gypsophylla because it lives in areas where the soil is loaded with gypsum. But the thing that I think makes these so delightfully weird is their flowers. They look like, I don't know, a cross between a splayed hand and a spider in a way. Really, really bizarre little things. They're quite closely related to Dorstenia gigas, which is the king of the Dorstenias, lives over the sea in Socotra. Beautiful plants, but these things can grow similarly massive. The only difference I find is that they are far more difficult to grow in cultivation. I've lost a couple of them over the years, but the good news is I've got 2 of them flowering now, so you never know. Maybe this year I'll have a bit of luck producing seeds and building up the population again. So that's the Dorstenias of Somalia. Now, these are plants that typically grow in the hills and the crevices. And as a result, if you are growing them, they don't want full blasting sun. They like more of a partial shade position. Keep them shaded, keep them moist and keep them warm, and they will just grow relentlessly. And like me, maybe one day you can have a massive collection of them yourself. But as far as I'm concerned, it's not the Euphorbias, it's not the Aloes, and it's not the Dorstenias that provide the most interesting plants of our botanical exploration of Somalia. It is the Asclepiads, members of the Apocynaceae family related to the Stapelias and the Huernias. Those stinky flowered carrion plants that you can find all over Africa, up into Arabia and further beyond. Now, the first of the plants I want to share with you is this one, Edithcolia grandis. Now, Edithcolia grandis, like Dorstenia foetida, is not endemic to Somalia, but it does live there. And I suppose the wonderful thing about this plant is its flowers. They do stink to high heaven. I've had the joy recently of giving one a sniff, but they're called Persian carpet flowers, and for very good reason. They are probably the most delightfully intricate, remarkably beautiful flower in perhaps the entire plant kingdom. The reason that they look like that is because they're trying to mimic rotting flesh, which is utterly revolting, but also fascinating because they get pollinated by flies. A fantastic plant. Now, I haven't had this one for too long, and I'm hoping that soon enough it's going to flower. I nursed it through the winter. They're notoriously finicky plants going through cold weather. Somehow this one survived, and you never know. I might be lucky enough to get a nice big Persian carpet flower blooming on this thing over the following months. But this thing doesn't even approach the levels of weird that I'm about to show you. When I was talking about Aloe somaliensis, I mentioned that idea of camouflage. It's a bleak, inhospitable place. It demands plants mimic something to avoid being eaten, especially when they're not loaded with toxins or covered with spines, like a lot of the succulents tend to rely on. And so I introduce you to a plant called Pseudolithos cubiformis. Now that name, cubiformis, is reflective of its growth form, because as it grows ever larger, it comes to look more and more like a cube. And you probably think to yourself, a cube? What's that got to do with camouflage? Well, when you look at the environment that it grows in, these big chunky shards of rock, you really get a sense of how well camouflaged these plants can be by taking on that abnormal shape. It's really, really remarkable. It's another plant that has revoltingly stinky flowers, attracts flies from all over the place, and it sits within a broader genus, the Pseudolithos, that are all utterly magnificent and weird. Some of them are more ball-shaped, some of them like this, cubes, and others just look like weird mutant tentacled things. Really well worth exploring if you love the weird and the wonderful just as I do. But there's another asclepiad that I really, really want to talk about, which is better than all of them. The plant that I'm speaking about is called Whitesloanea crassa, and it's not a plant that I am fortunate enough to have in my collection. I would love to get one at some point, but at the moment I'm not quite there yet. Recently though, I had the good fortune of seeing one in a private collection, and it's mind-blowing. It does look a little bit cube-shaped in that cubiformis kind of way, but it's also grey, warty textured, doesn't actually really look alive. Now the really interesting thing about Whitesloanea crassa is that it's a bit of a mystery. These plants were first discovered about a century ago out in the wilds of Somalia, and subsequent botanical expeditions didn't find any further trace of them. Occasionally one of them seems to pop up here and there, but it has long been believed that there is the potential that this plant is extinct. There are other mysterious stories though about how Somali tribespeople keep the location a very closely guarded secret. The thing about Whitesloanea crassa is that it's really emblematic of the mysterious botanical nature of this whole landscape, because we don't really know what's out there. And somehow we know that this plant exists, and somehow it's found its way into cultivation. And now it's being reproduced somewhat prolifically in an attempt to ensure the survival of the species. But does it exist in nature? Who knows? Has it just been eaten off the face of Somalia by goats? Who knows? If you walk past the next hill, do you just find an endless sweeping plain of them? Who knows? Because this is the thing, Somalia is a place of mystery when it comes to modern Western botanical science. It's just so inaccessible for both environmental and also human reasons that we don't really have the opportunity to go off and explore the landscape as well as we can. Even those botanical expeditions that have been made, and I have to stress, every couple of decades. We're not talking about scientists wandering off into the wilderness every other week. Every couple of decades, people go off, launch an expedition. And by and large, those expeditions are heavily restricted by where the roads, the very sparse roads, cut through the very bleak environment. No one's putting backpacks on their shoulders and trekking for weeks on end into the unknown. So that's the thing. Whitesloanea crassa is a beautiful plant, and if you ever get the opportunity to grow one, I say jump at it. They're very, very rare and really quite beautiful in their own unique way. But to me, they stand for so much more than just the joy of collecting, the weird and the wonderful stuff that I like to amass, and I'm sure many of you like to amass too. They're symbolic of the greater mystery of the landscape from which they come. A landscape that is bleak, arid, but also surprisingly beautiful, and also incredibly mysterious, at least to Western science. Bears thinking about. And so that's the wonderful world of Somali succulents. I'm sure you can agree, they're pretty weird, hey? And they're really well worth growing, but many of them I have to stress this, are very, very difficult in cultivation and probably best suited to advanced collectors who have a bit of experience with looking after these things, because they all have a tendency to want to die. But also really rewarding when you do keep them alive. Anyway, that's Arid Zine for another week. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll catch you next Monday.